Good evening. My name is Gwen Moore, and I'm the curator of urban landscape and community identity at the Missouri Historical Society. On behalf of MHS, I would like to welcome you to St. Louis History Live. We're very pleased to have you join us virtually, so thank you for being here. I'd like to introduce you to our guest presenter. Colin Garden is here with me, and he will be discussing his recent book, Citizen Brown: Race, Democracy, and Inequality in the St. Louis Suburbs. Professor Gordon, thank you for being here. Before we get started, I need to quickly mention a few details about how tonight's program will run. This will be a roughly 40-minute presentation followed by 20 minutes of questions and answers. You can submit questions through the Q&A button on your toolbar. Please know that we will do our best, but we may not have time to answer all of your questions. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to view it again or share tonight's presentation with others, it will be posted on the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel early next week. Your feedback is always important to us. We would really appreciate it if you could answer a few questions for us after the program. A Kobo Toolbox survey will soon open in another tab in your browser, so keep your eye out for that when you leave this session. I know that some of you who are watching are Missouri Historical Society members, so thank you. We're grateful for your support. And if you are not a member, we would love for you to consider joining today. You can see a link to our website in the chat box. We also sincerely thank city and county residents for your tax contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District, which enables us to bring you programs like the one you're going to see tonight. And lastly, before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our guest presenter. Colin Garden is F. Wendell Miller Professor of History at the University of Iowa, where he has taught since 1994. He is the author of Citizen Brown, as I mentioned earlier, Race, Democracy, and Inequality in the St. Louis Suburbs, Growing Apart, A Political History of American Inequality, and a book that I'm sure that a lot of people here in St. Louis know, and really across the country. Mapping Decline, St. Louis, and the Fate of American City. Besides, he's written many other books. He's a very prolific author, really first-rate scholar. He has written for The Nation, In These Times, Atlantic Cities, Jacobin, and Dissent, where he's a regular contributor. His digital projects include online companions to Citizen Brown and Mapping Decline. And before I turn it over to Professor Gordon, I'd just like to say that Mapping Decline and both now Citizen Brown are both staples in my library and are so critical to the work that I do here. They're like my go-to reference works. These books are very important, not just for what they tell us about St. Louis, and they're definitely important for that, but what they tell us about cities across the country, what they tell us about race. And I think these books, particularly Citizen Brown, when I was reading it, I was thinking about how relevant it is to what is going on today, because it will help you to understand why we're at this certain point in our history right today when so many people are out on the street protesting. So I would really urge you to read this book, to buy this book, and make it a part of your permanent library. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gordon.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And my presentation is going to consist mostly of slides of some of the very striking maps of racial disparities and racial inequality across St. Louis County. So I'm going to go ahead and share that screen now. So Citizen Brown is a book that it comes out of the research that I did for Mapping Decline, but it shifts its focus in a sense to some of the small sort of patchwork municipalities of St. Louis County and tries to answer the question, which I think was on a lot of at least national reporters' minds at the time Michael Brown was shot, as to why such a stark racial confrontation would happen in the suburbs. My presentation has 5 parts. I want to talk a little bit about the larger sort of context of race and housing in St. Louis. Some of this material will be from Mapping Decline. And then I want to spend the bulk of my presentation talking about the way in which that larger history, I think, fundamentally shapes and has shaped the way in which African Americans experience citizenship in the suburbs, particularly of St. Louis County. So let's start with the background of St. Louis. Of course, St. Louis was one of a number of cities early in the 20th century to pass, or at least attempt to pass, a racial zoning ordinance that actually carved out those blocks in the city in which African Americans could live. The St. Louis ordinance, which was passed by referendum in 1916, was alongside a couple of other similar ordinances around the country struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917. And so local realtors responded because they couldn't explicitly zone for racial occupancy by establishing what they call an unrestricted zone. That is an area of the city in which realtors were allowed to sell or rent to African Americans. And as you can see, this largely echoes the footprint of existing African American occupancy, that is the Ville in the sort of central north side, and then the sort of Mill Creek Valley central corridor, which was a large swath of rental working class housing. Those restrictions in turn were accompanied by almost 800 separate agreements of racial restriction attached to individual pieces of property or individual subdivisions. These racially restricted deed covenants were enormously influential in shaping segregation in St. Louis. The ones to the south and the southwest corner of the city are largely on large subdivisions like St. Louis Hills. The ones on the north were cobbled together in older neighborhoods to try and stem the expansion of African American occupancy from the Ville. And those restrictions from the recorders of deeds looked like this. Their sort of offensive clause was basically a definition, a nuisance definition of property. So you couldn't have a slaughterhouse, a junk shop, or a rag picking establishment. But secondly, you and subsequent owners of land could not sell, convey, lease, or rent to a Negro or Negroes. These were both considered destructive of property values. Now, these covenants accomplished a very stark segregation in the city of St. Louis in the first half of the 20th century, not only on their own, but because they were sort of carried forward or reinforced by other policies as well. So this is a standard private real estate appraisal form from the 1930s. And as you can see, the basic criteria here is what's the racial influence and are there deed restrictions? This was how realtors and banks valued property. The same assumptions were carried forward into federal redlining efforts. And so this is the infamous Homeowners Loan Corporation map of St. Louis, which rated neighborhoods largely based on their racial occupancy and the presence of deed restrictions. And of course, what's important about these deed covenants is they not only shaped residential patterns in the city of St. Louis, but they were absolutely ubiquitous in the suburbs of St. Louis County, which were being built at the time. These large-scale restrictions formed what contemporaries called a sort of Berlin Wall between racial occupancy in the city and in the county. And homes were actually marketed on this basis. And so here we have Fox Meadows, a subdivision in the county, which is explicitly marketed as being with protective restrictions. Those protective restrictions were, for the most part, racial in origin. And that in turn, those sorts of restrictions were ultimately sort of sanctified and carried forward by patterns of exclusive zoning in the suburbs. Many of the suburbs of St. Louis County incorporated and zoned in the wake of the Supreme Court decision that outlawed race-restricted deed covenants, because they saw exclusive single-family zoning as a way of sustaining those restrictions. So the net result is a particular movement of people and a pattern of settlement in Greater St. Louis that looks like this. So you can see the city and the county here. The blue footprint on the north part of the map there is the footprint of the Ferguson-Florissant School District, because we'll be coming back to that area. And these maps simply show the increase or the decrease in the racial population between two census years. So as we can see, between 1940 and 1950, there's a tremendous in-migration of African Americans for the wartime boom, a sort of extension of that great migration, and the beginning of sort of white flight out of the city. So every red dot is 10 white people leaving the city. The white dots in the suburbs are an increase in the population. And this pattern continues between 1950 and 1960. Although what we see here as well, coming out of downtown, is the clearance of the Mill Creek Valley, which sees a movement of the African American population into the north and west, or north and west in the city, and the continued and now dramatic outmigration of white residents of St. Louis. And as we go forward between 1960 and 1970, now the white population is moving even further out. I'm only showing you the St. Louis County here, but the outer counties are starting to see increases as well. And you begin to see the emptying out of the city itself. So the city of St. Louis's population peaked at almost 900,000 in 1950. But today, of course, it's only in the neighborhood of 300,000. And much of those losses you can see here of Blacks and white citizens leaving the city. As we move to the last 50 years, this pattern becomes a pattern of Black flight as well out of the north side. So again, the orange dots show a decline in the African American population. And as you can see, as we move from the 1970s to the 1980s, that the city is emptying out and the African American population is settling increasingly in North County. This pattern continues to the present day. So what are the implications of that for the city, for the county, and for African Americans who live in both? One pattern that we see quite clearly is dramatic decline in disinvestment on the north side of St. Louis. So this is a Sanborn fire insurance map that shows you how densely developed this particular pocket of North St. Louis was. All of these houses were gone by 2003, vacated or abandoned. And of course, much of North St. Louis streetscape has this sort of broken tooth, one house on the street kind of pattern. And this is a sort of a tremendous loss in residential property values, but it's also a sort of commensurate loss in public goods and things like schools, investments in streets, and that sort of thing. And for the African American population, it means a dramatic loss of wealth. What's important to recognize about St. Louis is that after the Shelley versus Kramer decision, striking down the racial covenants in 1948, dramatic white flight came out of North St. Louis, which opened up opportunities for investment for African American families. And the home ownership rate on North St. Louis actually skyrocketed for African Americans. But almost all of that investment went into properties that were rapidly declining in value. So what we see today as a legacy of that is a dramatic gap in wealth. So among all families, white families, at the median, all families have $171,000 in wealth. And most of that is home equity for most in the middle and upper middle class. Families with children, it's a little bit lower. For African American families, it's $20,000 for all families, and it's zero. And what that means is that half of all African Americans, families with children, have negative wealth. They're basically in debt. Now, we'll come back to that because it has a tremendous amount of importance in explaining patterns of movement out into St. Louis County. But what I want to turn next to is the sort of first element by which I would argue citizenship is sort of fundamentally undermined and compromised for African Americans in St. Louis County. And that's by the way in which local boundaries are drawn. So here is the county. And what I'm going to show you here is, so the red are single family homes that are being mapped by the year in which they're built. The green are incorporated municipalities. So we see Ferguson and Kirkwood, some of the early incorporated municipalities. And the yellow shading are when those municipalities add territory through annexation. And I'm just going to play this forward every 10 years. And I want you to notice the pattern by which the residential development is sort of pushing ahead of the incorporations and annexations. That's particularly true between 1930 and 1940. And then between 40 and 50, we see a flurry of annexation and incorporations because those postage stamp municipalities in St. Louis County are responding to Shelley versus Kramer. What were originally subdivisions built by private developers on unincorporated county land are now becoming municipalities. They're incorporated. And that gives them, of course, among other things, the right to control land use. And that's largely the reason that this happens. So, as I argue, both in Citizen Brown and in Mapping Decline, I think the remarkably fragmented nature of St. Louis County is largely driven by a desire to sustain segregation. And every sort of fragment of the county, whether it's wealthy Ladue or struggling Normandy, plays its own role in sustaining that segregation. Increasingly, the county becomes almost completely urbanized. But you can see, again, residential development sort of pushing cul-de-sacs out into the cornfields and unincorporated land. What that means, among other things, is that it's private developers making all the substantial decisions about land use. They're doing large lot, single family homes. And then what comes later is the incorporation of the municipality. So just move forward to the present and you can see, roughly what that pattern looks like. It's even more striking, and this is what I sort of zero in on Citizen Brown, if we look at that at a more sort of micro level. So let's consider what happens in Elmwood Park, a small pocket of unincorporated land that's sort of tucked between Olivet and Overland in central North County. Elmwood Park was platted in the 1890s as a very sort of rudimentary subdivision with fairly small lots. And within its first 20 years became largely occupied by African Americans because it was affordable, because of its location on the rail line, which allowed people to commute into the city to work as domestics and chauffeurs. The area is very lightly developed. So here we have 1910 showing the 2000 boundaries of Overland and all of that. And the same logic follows with this map. We see the red parcels mapped by the year in which they're built. But as of now, Elmwood Park, all of this sits on unincorporated land. Here's Elmwood Park. So we move forward, we see a little more development in the 1920s. And then all of that is incorporated, largely undeveloped, but incorporated in 1930 as, again, a way to control land use. Move forward, we can see Overland there are subdivisions being built there. It's incorporated on a fairly small footprint in 1939, but both Olivet and Overland over time will add new territory as new houses are built. But see what the net effect is. They surround and effectively completely quarantine Elmwood Park. And this is important because not only is Elmwood Park not being included in the corporate footprint, but that means it's being excluded from the infrastructure that's being built with that development. So none of the water lines go into Elmwood Park, none of the sanitary sewers go in, none of the gas lines. Elmwood Park becomes this unserviced and unincorporated pocket. And then to add insult to injury, Olivet and Overland zone their land to even further quarantine Elmwood Park. As you can see, the gray areas, they sort of buttress or surround Elmwood Park with industrial land. So there are no African-American residential areas next to white residential areas. The same thing happens in Meacham Park. Meacham Park has a very similar history, and here it is nestled between Crestwood, Sunset Hills, and Kirkwood. So again, we start in 1910, and we see only Kirkwood is incorporated at the time, and there's scattered development in the other areas. But as we scroll forward in time, we see Kirkwood adds territory, adds new development. 1940, 45. Sunset Hills is incorporated, and then Crestwood, adding new territory. And again, exactly the same. This pocket of African-American occupancy, Meacham Park, is completely surrounded by the new corporate municipalities. And then again, zoning adds insult to injury. In this case, what we see is that Meacham Park, which is right here, is cordoned off from the surrounding communities by commercial development. And on the southern border, right here, this is I-44, which cuts across and becomes the southern boundary, and then Big Bend becomes the sort of hard arterial northbound. And there's really only one or two entrances in and out of Meacham Park. And again, it becomes this little quarantined pocket of African-American occupancy. So that, I think, fundamentally sort of compromises the rights of those citizens to enjoy in the larger development of the county, but it also segregates local services and segregates citizenship in that way. Because it's important to recognize that what comes with those municipalities are other jurisdictions like school districts. And so I'll show you one example from another African-American pocket of development, Kinloch, further north. So here's Kinloch, nestled now in the middle of what is now the Ferguson-Florissant School District. Now in 1936, the school districts in that area looked like that. So the outlines here are of the three municipalities, Kinloch, Ferguson, and Florissant. The Kinloch School District included Kinloch, which was 99% African-American, and the surrounding community of Berkeley, which was almost as overwhelmingly white. But Berkeley was not yet incorporated. Whereas the Ferguson-Florissant School District included part of Florissant, all of Ferguson, and some unincorporated land in between. But what happened at this point is the white homeowners that were buying homes in Berkeley wanted to separate themselves from the Kinloch School District to create two fundamentally segregated school districts. And they did that by using a loophole in Missouri law, which allowed a new municipality to create a school district that matched its footprint. So Berkeley incorporates in 1937 and basically separates from Kinloch. At that moment, Berkeley becomes one of the better funded school districts in the entire state because of its strong local property tax base, and Kinloch becomes the poorest. So again, the sort of a harsh segregation of one of the sort of basic elements of citizenship of equality of opportunity or education. And it's not until 1975 that the current Ferguson-Florissant School District was created as part of a Justice Department lawsuit to undo that injustice. And so now we have a large, what's typical in the county, a sort of large school district, which incorporates little bits and pieces of all these patchwork municipalities. And as the Justice Department said at the time, the cumulative effect of the actions of the state and local defendants has been the creation, operation, support, and general supervision of a school district which is unconstitutionally segregated and whose students are denied an equal educational opportunity. So that's one example of the way in which these municipal quarantines could parcel out services in uneven ways. Another is in basic services like potable water and sanitary sewers. It's important to recognize that very early subdivisions like Elmwood Park were really just lines on a map. They didn't have sanitary sewers, they had wells, and they had outhouses for crickets. Later subdivision development, beginning in the 1920s, constructs infrastructure alongside the homes. So when you buy a home, you're buying hookup to a sanitary sewer, you're buying a tap with clean running water at the same time. So as I said earlier, one of the implications of the way in which Meacham Park and Elmwood Park are surrounded is that they're cut off from those basic services. So here's an example looking at Meacham Park. So the gray lines here are the development of sewers in South St. Louis County. So we're starting here in 1920. You can see the municipal footprints, and there's unincorporated Meacham Park tucked on the lower corner of Kirkwood. So the sewers are developed alongside the street grid of those new developments. And as you can see, 1940, 1960, it's not until 1980 that sanitary sewers are extended into Meacham Park, and only with a large federal grant that accomplishes that. Now, what's interesting here is that doesn't really sort of solve the problem of creating equality of services, because the homes in Meacham Park are so old and unserviced. It's the responsibility of the homeowner to establish a hookup to the sewer that runs down the center of the street. And this is very expensive, and many of the houses in Meacham Park did not have the internal plumbing infrastructure that could take city water pressure. So it's still a long time before, after 1980, before Meacham Park, the residential footprint in Meacham Park has modern services, fully modern services. One other episode that I open actually Citizen Brown with, which is a very sort of stark reminder of this uneven delivery of services, is a horrific house fire in Meacham Park in 1965, in which 6 young children die because Meacham Park, as an unincorporated pocket, is not in the local fire district. It has a small volunteer fire department, and when the fire breaks out, their fire truck won't start. And it takes over 20 minutes for fire trucks from neighboring municipalities to finally make it to Meacham Park, after which the family has perished. Now, as if that sort of pattern of sort of quarantine and uneven services was not enough, there's also active displacement of African Americans from the few pockets in St. Louis County in which they live. And this takes place under the auspices of urban renewal. So one of the sort of steep ironies that I explore in Citizen Brown is the fact that the modern subdivisions sort of flow around Elmwood Park and Meacham Park like rocks in a stream. They leave them in these little unincorporated pockets that are underserviced. And then eventually, county officials sort of turn around and say, why are these tar paper shacks and outhouses in the middle of our, impeccable suburban fabric? What can we do about this? So this is Elmwood Park in 1958. Meacham Park, this is the Meacham Park YMCA on the left with the outhouses in the back. And so what the county does in the very first meeting of its Land Clearance Reclamation Authority, or its Urban Renewal Authority, is identify all of the pockets of African American occupancy in St. Louis County as targets for renewal. And aside from a couple of flood-prone areas a little bit further west, these are the only pockets of the county that are targeted for renewal. Meacham Park undergoes a complete urban renewal plan at this time. So this is the footprint in 1955. This is the urban renewal plan. And so a large chunk to the west is turned into commercial and industrial land, and then a more modest footprint of homes is built on the rest. This is Meacham Park, or Elmwood Park rather, mid-development or mid-redevelopment in the 1960s. And this is a map of what happened to the families of Elmwood Park. So at the time the relocation plans or the redevelopment plans started, about 100 African-American families lived in Elmwood Park. Now, under federal law, those families were supposed to be given the opportunity, if residential land was being redeveloped for better residential land, of moving back. But in fact, what the St. Louis County officials did is they went door to door with Elmwood Park and they handed out applications for public housing downtown. So the redevelopers of Elmwood Park were required by federal law to keep track of where the families that were displaced went. And as you can see, the vast majority settled, here in Kinloch, in already deeply segregated areas of the north side, in North Webster Groves. Some went to Meacham Park, but only, so here's Elmwood Park, the little yellow triangle or rectangle. Only one family that is displaced by this urban renewal moves back by 1964. What happens, and this is another story that I opened with, is that then Esther Brooks, who was a resident of Elmwood Park, and a number of her neighbors sue the county over the loss of their properties, because they lose, the vast majority move from properties that they owned to properties that they rented, lost much of the equity in their homes. This case goes all the way to the Missouri Supreme Court, which finds in their decision in 1967 that the plaintiffs, the families who were suing, did not have standing to sue because they no longer lived in Elmwood Park. Of course, that was exactly the point, but this was the way in which relocation from urban renewal, overwhelmingly of African-American families, worked through the 1960s until there was a new law passed in 1970. So a dramatic displacement of African-American families. So not only, quarantining and segregating the pockets of African-Americans that were in the county, but then rediscovering them a decade later and actively removing them from the homes that they'd lived in some cases, for generations. The same thing happens on a slightly different timetable in Meacham Park. So this is Meacham Park in 1955. This is a survey of land use showing the sort of vacated properties, particularly on the footprint where I-44 is going to go. And then in the early 1950s, Kirkwood extends its border, rather than incorporating Meacham Park or annexing it, it annexes just the commercial frontage on Kirkwood Avenue, which is enormously controversial within Meacham Park, because what Kirkwood really did was they took all of the property that had any tax value and annexed it into Kirkwood and left the rest for eventual redevelopment. Across this era, there's a constant debate within Kirkwood about whether to annex Meacham Park. The upside is that if they annexed Meacham Park, they would be able to police Meacham Park and control its residents. The downside is if they annexed Meacham Park, they would inherit, as the mayor said at the time, all of the problems of Meacham Park. They would have to provide it with basic services. So I-44 cuts across the bottom corner, and there's another survey of land use in 1976. And then eventually the redevelopment of Meacham Park occurs after the urban renewal era, but under the sort of modern version of urban redevelopment, which is tax increment financing of things like shopping malls. So here's the tax increment financing plan that's drafted for Meacham Park in 1994. At the time, the promise is made that the boundary will only move so far, but in fact, fully a third of the residential properties in Meacham Park are displaced. There is some reinvestment in the residential side from the tax increment financing zone, but the lack of community input and the lack of community involvement in the redevelopment and its benefits left a lingering bitterness in Meacham Park. And that, of course, boiled over in the Kirkwood shootings in 2008. Cookie Thornton was one of the Meacham Park residents that supported the annexation and the redevelopment because he felt he was going to get, as a small contractor, some share of that business. He didn't. What Cookie Thornton got instead of the benefits of redevelopment was he got the sort of downside of being annexed into Kirkwood. Meacham Park was rolled into Kirkwood in 1990. And what happens is that makes Meacham Park subject to all the municipal code of Kirkwood, and Cookie Thornton starts being fined for storing construction materials in his driveway, parking his truck on the street, and that sort of thing. And this, I think, provides us with the jumping off point or the link to the death of Michael Brown. Because, as Cookie Thornton's experience suggests, as this testament to the civil rights hearings in St. Louis County in 1970 suggests, African-American residents got lesser and baser services for the most part, with one exception. They did experience more policing. As this one resident told the Civil Rights Commission, I think we got more police protection than we required when I first moved here. I don't know if they're protecting me or protecting someone from me. And so this, I think, gives us the backdrop to the death of Michael Brown. So we see a stark pattern of segregation in Greater St. Louis, this north-south divide, what's called the Delmar divide in the city, but now extends out into the county. And the erosion of that Berlin Wall between city and county as African Americans move out into the North County suburbs. Now that movement itself into what urban historians call second-hand suburbs like Ferguson is largely driven by the fact that these older suburbs on the north side were built earlier and they have smaller square footage than do, the McMansions that are being built in suburbs like Ladue and other central county municipalities. So for African Americans who are leaving the city, and remember with that stark racial wealth gap, this is the area of the county in which homes are affordable and in which there is some opportunity for multifamily zoning or rental apartments. But as this is happening, as racial transitioning is occurring through those municipalities in North County, the property tax and sales tax base of those municipalities is starting to collapse. Because of course, white flight is moving even further out and dragging the tax capacity with it. So as we see, the median sales price of homes, of single family homes in the region, much higher for Clayton and Ladue. Ferguson looks much more like the city of St. Louis, absolute sort of flat property values. A very sort of intense experience of foreclosures, up to a third of all property transactions during the Great Recession in Ferguson, much higher than the rest of the county. And to make it even more difficult, while the residential values are falling, one of the strategies that cities like Ferguson use is to give away their commercial property tax through abatements. So we have these tax agreement financing districts that subsidize retail development and these enterprise zones that rebate property taxes on the footprint of some of the sort of major business investment in a city like Ferguson. So the residential property tax base is collapsing, the commercial tax base is being given away. And the sales tax base, such as it is migrating west with the population. So we see, if we look across Ferguson budgets for this almost 50-year period, that revenues from sales taxes are tanking, as are revenues from property taxes. So what then do these municipalities do? One thing they have to do is raise their taxes. So we see here the school districts in St. Louis County and St. Louis City, and the small numbers there in each district is the local levy or the rate of property taxation for that district. And as you can see, these struggling communities in North County are the ones with the highest tax rates because they have to push the levy to its upper limit to get enough local revenues for their schools. So that's one strategy. Another strategy, of course, is what we call predatory or revenue policing. That is, municipalities that rely more and more on extracting revenue from their poorest citizens by enforcing the municipal code, by fining people for not cutting their grass, or by fining young African-American men like Michael Brown for walking down the middle of the street. And so, somewhat infamously, as the Department of Justice uncovered, the city of Ferguson has sort of flatlined revenues from conventional sources, but an increased reliance on fines and forfeitures through their municipal courts, which become almost 20% of revenues at the time Michael Brown is killed. So when Darren Wilson and Michael Brown meet on Canfield Drive in August of 2014, there is, I would argue, a couple things going on. First of all, the police in these sort of fragmented and especially transitional municipalities in North County are informally charged with maintaining segregation, with identifying those who are out of place, who are not where they should be. And so the police are infamous for example, across this history, camping out at the entrance to Elmwood Park and Meacham Park, or blocking off those entrances to some degree as a way of controlling the movement of African-American residents. So it's this long history of segregation and the fact that these municipalities are designed to sustain that segregation that put the police in that role. And then the second part, as I just discussed, is the fact that as these municipalities are undergoing racial transition, they're also struggling to maintain their infrastructure and their property tax base, and increasingly turning the police and policing to keep the lights on at City Hall. And so, as the Department of Justice concluded, the police see residents, especially those who live in predominantly African-American neighborhoods, less as constituents, less as citizens to be protected than as potential offenders and sources of revenue. Again, very uneven access to conventional public goods and services like schools, clean water, but intense access, and quite intentionally, to surveillance and policing. So I think overall, for African Americans in St. Louis County, this is a story in which citizenship is shaped and undermined on really every dimension of the way in which we run our cities, how we draw the boundaries of school districts and cities in order to include and exclude, how we provide services within those boundaries, who we provide those services to, the choices we make about development and redevelopment, about which neighborhoods we knock down and which ones we build up, and the way in which we raise revenue, the way in which we distribute that burden across the population, particularly stark when we start looking at sort of predatory policing and code enforcement, so infamous in St. Louis County in the last generation. And I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Gardner. And we are ready to take questions. Well, I have a question. You talked a lot about fragmentation, and you see that as a real problem. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and why has that been so destructive?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question, because the United States is not alone in having very sort of fragmented metropolitan regions made up of lots of municipalities. And so if you think of Greater St. Louis as a sort of organic economic and demographic entity, you might want to run the whole thing with one government and make decisions that are more equitable across the board. But people are fiercely attached to small units of government, in which they might be closer to their elected officials, in which those small units of government might have a better idea of what's going on the ground. But what research has shown is the United States is alone among countries in using that fragmentation primarily to accomplish and sustain segregation. And so it's not really building on the potential benefits of small-scale government. It's actually using the way in which boundaries are drawn to parcel out citizenship in ways that are really inequitable. And I think we're most familiar with that pattern when we think about the way school district boundaries are drawn, particularly in the past. There's a bit more of an effort to do that, to make that more equitable now. But what I try and underscore in Citizen Brown is the way in which our municipal borders were drawn performed exactly the same function. And you can see that sort of dramatically in the way they surround Elmwood Park and Meacham Park, with the intention of leaving those pockets of African-American occupancy out of the community, out of the definition of citizenship.
And we have a question here. What role did the Archdiocese of St. Louis and Catholic schools play in promoting sustaining segregation?
That's a good question, because it's really a very important element of the school part of the question. Because what it meant, in a sense, was that very early on, white families in St. Louis had very little investment in the public school system. So as long as the parochial schools became a sort of safety valve for those who wanted to get out of the public school system, the public school system in the city, and then hence the city itself, became seen as a place in which public were for African Americans and private goods were for white families. And so, I'm not so sure I would go so far as to say that, that the diocese itself had a role, a sort of active role in that. But the ability to have white flight not only out of those neighborhoods, but out of those schools even earlier is a very sort of important element of this story.
This is a question from Harold Roswell. It's a long one.
Okay.
For Richard Rothstein, the story of housing discrimination is a national one, and he anchors potential political action at the federal government. Your lens is local, focused on the St. Louis area. What does this St. Louis focus bring to the national story of housing discrimination? In what ways is it different from other, perhaps equally segregated cities?
Yeah, that's a very...
One more, I'm sorry. Does your focus on St. Louis change your approach to ameliorating federal housing discrimination's effects?
Yes, very good question. So I'm a big fan of Richard Rothstein's work, but I think we disagree a little bit on this point. I would argue in St. Louis and elsewhere that segregation is fundamentally accomplished by local and private means before there is significant federal involvement. So what we see in St. Louis and in most other cities is that by however you measure it, segregation between white and black occupancy is fully formed by 1940. What happens after 1940, which is the gist of Richard's work, which I think is spot on, is the federal government then becomes complicit in sustaining that, because it drags the logic of the race covenants into the way in which it rates property, into the way in which it subsidizes suburban development, into the way in which it sends signals to realtors and mortgagers and white homeowners and banks, and enables the white flight, which then seals that segregation for most of the rest of the 20th century. So I think in some respects it's a matter of sequencing, that I would argue that segregation is initially accomplished through intimidation and violence, that it's formalized through the legal instrument of the deed covenant. When that is declared illegal, that's when, or as that is declared illegal in the late 1940s, that's when state and federal policies and local policies like zoning and rating of property become important ways of sustaining that segregation. So they sustain it, but they don't create it.
Here's a question from Britt. How can a county like Kirkwood exactly annex one profitable part of a place like Meacham Park? Why is that allowed?
Well, it's not allowed anymore. The rules for municipal incorporation and annexation are set at the state level. And Missouri is somewhat infamous for having almost no rules until the series of court cases in the 1970s and 1980s. This is why, for example, you have these crazy patchwork municipalities in St. Louis County right in the city. In many states, you cannot create a new municipality right next to another one, because the judgment is, why don't you just annex that territory, into the original city? But in Missouri, there are very few such rules, and so you get lots of these, creation of these tiny little municipal fragments, and then you get these municipal fragments fighting with each other to take over the unincorporated parcels that are between them, or in the case of Meacham Park and Elmwood Park, to ignore them. So if it happened today in Missouri that Kirkwood made such a proposal, I think what the state would say, or what the rules would say, is no, you have to annex all of Meacham Park. You can't just take the part you like. If it happened, that was completely kosher.
A question from Nicole Shannon. Can you talk about the Delmar Divide and how that has shaped the St. Louis area?
Yeah, so the Delmar Divide, like a lot of cities, St. Louis relies on a sort of hard arterial boundary between predominantly white, predominantly black neighborhoods. And, so rail beds, creeks, parkland often play this role. And so we have, the Del Mar divide is exaggerated by the fact that south of Del Mar, there's a lot of sort of commercial rail bed corridor running out the center of the city. So it's a wider separation between North and South St. Louis. But what happens in the 1920s is that there's this concerted effort to surround the Ville with race restrictive deed covenants. And they sort of draw the boundary or set the line at Del Mar, south of the Ville, and create the circumstance whereby most of the African-American occupancy and increase in homeownership and renting is going to occur north of that line. And then once that boundary is sort of set, then, when the covenants are no longer enforceable and the ones north of the Ville start to fall apart, the African-American occupancy sort of moves north from Del Mar.
This is a question that's concerned about, do you think that this could happen again in St. Louis? And if so, how do we stop it?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I wouldn't say it's going to happen again, but I would say it's still happening. Like, you still see these patterns on the ground. There's a long shadow of the original segregation, and we see that fragmentation still taking its toll. One of the unfortunate parts of this story is the way in which the Better Together effort, I think, really poisoned the well for what is, in principle, the proper solution, which is to decide more on a regional basis. So one way to think about it is we already do some of these things on a regional basis because we have no choice. So we have a metropolitan sewer district. It doesn't make sense on efficiency grounds to stop the sewer lines at every municipal boundary. We also have regional transportation planning. You can't get federal transportation grants unless you do regional transportation planning. So what I would argue is whether you erase those municipal boundaries or not, there are other things you could do at the regional level, like zoning or economic development, where you have to take into account what your neighbors are doing, solutions that are equitable for the whole region, rather than having sort of one municipality pitted against each other.
Well, I know that you discussed the Liddell case in your book to an extent, and this is a question about that case. The 1972 Liddell segregation case ended up funding wealthy suburban districts to take St. Louis African-American students. What did this desegregation case actually accomplish, given that certain county school districts are also primarily African-American and receive no funding? Does this perpetuate segregation?
Yeah, I mean, the long desegregation battle in St. Louis is a fascinating story because in some respects, St. Louis was not, while it's very Southern in some of its elements, it was not an immediate battleground over Brown versus Board of Education. That the St. Louis Board of Education had a desegregation plan in place, they're ready to go. But part of the reason that it was so, in a sense, so seamless was exactly what Minnie Liddell pointed out 20 years later, which was you can't desegregate your schools without desegregating your neighborhoods. And in fact, if you don't do the work on the residential side, then you end up with a tremendous burden of moving kids around in order to accomplish segregation, which is difficult enough within a district, but it's enormously complicated to do across district lines. And so, the Liddell litigation has these enormously complicated negotiations between county districts and the court and the city districts, and whether the county districts would opt in or out. And then, as the question suggests, the fact that it was those county districts who were already undergoing racial transition that were the ones who opted in, so bore most of the brunt of that. So it's really, an ongoing story.
You know, I know that you have a lot of thoughts about city-county mergers. I know you talked about it in Mapping Decline and also in Citizen Brown. So this is a question that relates to that. So would we benefit from the city and county coming together?
It depends who we is. I mean, one of the reasons it's never happened is because, you know, and it's come up, you know, in city or county politics once a generation since 1876 almost, is that there's always those who fear that they're going to be the winners or they're going to be the losers. And so, you know, St. Louis County may feel that, you know, we have the tax capacity. We don't want to join up with the city, which is in collapse. There was a moment in the 1960s and 70s when the African-American led wards in the city did not want to give up their political clout in a merger. So there's always this idea of winners and losers. But I think, you know, you have to keep your eye on the large picture, which is that everyone, collectively, the region is worse off if we allow this fragmentation to continue.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but it's a question that Scott Moeller has posed. He wants to know, what do you think about the privatization of Lambert Airport?
I mean, I think it's a bad idea, but, you know, just because I read the Facebook posts of my St. Louis friends, I wouldn't pretend expertise on that.
Okay. Okay, is there anything that can be done to change the way schools are funded? It's back to the school question. I know that you think that schools are really critical. Education is critical to citizenship. Is there anything that can be done to change the way schools are funded to ensure more equitably and resource schools across the board?
Yeah, so this is one area in which I think the fragmentation does enormous damage, and in which it would be relatively easy to simply say, you know, that school districts can remain where they are with their current boundaries. They can negotiate with their teachers, and they can establish curriculum and organize sports teams, but they do not get to hoard local revenues. That if all of the local revenues went into a pool, it could be distributed according to need and not according to property tax base. I mean, the problem, of course, is that the Missouri state funding formula that is supposed to equalize that has always been insufficient. And so your well-heeled outer suburban schools are always going to be much richer in resources than cities, the ones in North County or the ones in the city. And what we now know from, you know, a very important body of educational research is that that gap is widened by the ability of parents through school-based foundations to invest even further in enrichment activities in the well-resourced schools, which of course doesn't happen in the under-resourced schools. So I think some system by which you have sort of radical pooling of resources and then, you know, a higher floor under those resources is absolutely crucial. No other developed democratic nation in the world allows their schools to be funded in a way in which local patterns of poverty and tax capacity are reflected in schools. One fundamental thing that we've always recognized about schools is that they should provide what we call sort of starting gate equality, that they should equalize or erase, you know, inequalities that kids come to school with as much as possible. And they don't do that.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. There was a really probing question about the police, but that'll have to wait for another time. So I want to thank you so much, Professor Gardner, for sharing this history and your research for us this evening. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. For our audience, we would love for you to join us next time. There are 2 to 3 St. Louis History Live programs each week. You can see the next few listed here on the screen, which will be visible shortly. You can visit mohistory.org or Facebook to check out more upcoming virtual program. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and see you next time. And thank you so much, Professor Gordon. You've written a very important book.
Thank you, Gwen. It was a pleasure.
Mhm.